High achievers get stuck just like the rest of us, but they possess a micro-step protocol that snaps them out of paralysis instantly. In the next 20 minutes, you're going to learn the exact 5-minute mental trick top performers use to bypass procrastination entirely without ever waiting for motivation to strike.
I'm genuinely thrilled for our deep dive today because we are tackling a phantom that universally haunts everyone, the unstuck protocol.
Yeah, we are going through a stack of really fascinating source material that breaks down exactly how top performers conquer the absolute total paralysis of procrastination. And the best part, it's not magic at all. It is just mechanics.
It's purely mechanical.
It truly is a mechanical process, and understanding that machinery is vital. Our mission today is to completely rewire how you approach the specific tasks you have been avoiding. We are going to examine the psychological friction that keeps you frozen in place, and then provide a heavily structured, highly practical protocol to systematically dismantle that friction. Right, because the goal here isn't to make you feel guilty about putting things off. It's to equip you with the precise neurobiological tools to never let that hesitation control your day again.
Exactly. No guilt, just action.
Okay, that was the opening hook. Now, let's move to the diagnosis. To figure out how to get unstuck, we first have to understand why we freeze in the first place. Okay, let's unpack this because the source material brings up a really pervasive myth about procrastination. We generally assume that if we are putting something off, it's just a moral failing.
We think we're just being lazy.
Yeah, lazy or we lack discipline. But the notes suggest that laziness actually has very little to do with it. What is actually happening in the brain when we avoid a task?
Well, the diagnosis requires us to completely reframe our understanding of the problem. When we look at the psychology and the underlying neuroscience, most people do not procrastinate out of laziness. They procrastinate because the task itself feels too big.
It's just too overwhelming.
Exactly. It registers in the brain as an overwhelming threat. You have to remember, your brain is an incredibly efficient machine that is constantly trying to conserve energy.
Yeah.
When it perceives a massive cognitive load, like doing a year's worth of taxes or writing a 50-page business proposal, your threat detection circuitry essentially hijacks your executive function.
So it's trying to save you.
Yes.
Yes.
Your mind actively wants to protect you from what it perceives as a dangerous depletion of your energy reserves.
So instead of seeing just a mundane to-do list, our brain is reacting as if we are facing a literal survival situation. I want to try and translate what the sources are describing into a feeling. Imagine you are suddenly standing at the base of a jagged, freezing, towering rock wall.
Just massive and intimidating.
Right, and you can hear the icy wind roaring in your ears, whipping around you, making you freeze up entirely as you stare at this terrifying, unscalable peak. And because you are so utterly focused on the sheer terror of that massive, frozen climb, you completely ignore the small, manageable pebble step resting right beneath your boot.
What's fascinating here is the absolute neurobiological reality of that physical response. The psychology of ignoring that first simple step is deeply rooted in our amygdala.
Which is our threat center.
Right. Your amygdala doesn't know the difference between an insurmountable icy mountain and an overwhelmingly large spreadsheet. It simply registers the sheer size of the demand as acute distress. It pumps the brakes, it triggers a spike in cortisol and tells you, we do not have the metabolic energy reserves for this climb, so we are going to retreat to safety.
And that retreat usually looks like scrolling on your phone for an hour.
Or suddenly deciding the garage needs to be reorganized right this second. We avoid the pebble because acknowledging the pebble requires us to acknowledge the mountain. But the high achievers we are analyzing in this protocol do the exact opposite. They blindfold themselves to the mountain and only allow themselves to feel for that single pebble.
Okay, that is the diagnosis. Now let's move to the first two habits of this solution. Because once we know we're just scared of the mountain, we need to know exactly how to shrink it down. The source material outlines habit 1 as structure, utilizing something called the 2-minute rule.
This is a game changer.
It really is. It suggests breaking the massive task down until the first step takes less than 2 minutes to complete. Why is that specific time frame so critical to our biology?
The 2-minute threshold is critical because it fundamentally alters the activation energy required to begin. In physics, activation energy is the minimum amount of energy needed to start a reaction. The same principle applies to human behavior.
So if the energy requirement is too high, we just don't start.
Precisely. If you are avoiding a massive project, putting finish project or even work on project on your agenda keeps the activation energy impossibly high. Your amygdala keeps ringing the alarm. But when you shrink the task to something that takes less than 120 seconds, the resistance to it becomes biologically negligible.
You are flying under the radar of your own threat detection system.
You bypass it entirely.
That reframes the whole concept of starting. The notes provide a few examples. If you want to build a habit of going for a morning run, the task isn't run 5 miles. That's the terrifying mountain.
The 2-minute task is simply put on your running shoes and tie the laces.
Or if you need to write a complex essay, the task isn't draft the introduction. The 2-minute task is open a blank document and save the file name. But how does doing something so incredibly small actually get the larger project done?
It initiates a positive dopamine loop. Once you complete that micro step, once the shoes are tied or the document is saved, your brain registers a small victory. You get a tiny hit of dopamine, which provides the momentum to take the next small step.
You build momentum instantly.
Right. You've lowered the barrier to entry so drastically that it feels almost absurd not to execute the task. You are tricking your brain into starting before it has the chance to mount a defense.
That makes perfect sense, but it leads to an interesting question about our physical surroundings. Even if you shrink the task down to 2 minutes, what happens if the environment around you is actively fighting your ability to focus?
That is a massive roadblock for most people.
Right, which brings us to habit 2, friction, which the protocol calls the environment reset. The material brings in Abraham Lincoln for this one, quoting his famous advice to sharpen the axe. He said if he had 6 hours to chop down a tree, he'd spend the first 4 sharpening the axe.
It's a brilliant framing for prep work.
But how does sharpening the axe translate to our modern workspaces?
In our modern context, the physical space is simply an extension of your cognitive space. Every single object in your peripheral vision acts as microscopic cognitive friction. If you sit down at a desk covered in coffee mugs from yesterday, stacks of unopened mail, and tangled charging cables, your brain is unconsciously processing every single one of those items.
It's just draining your energy in the background.
Constantly. It is constantly attempting to categorize and monitor them. That background visual processing drains the exact mental energy you desperately need to overcome the inertia of starting your 2-minute task.
So clearing it is essential.
Yes, by doing an environment reset, by physically cleaning that space, you are removing the friction. You are sharpening the axe so that when you finally swing, it actually cuts through the wood.
Remember this simple formula. A messy desk equals a messy mind. It's like trying to cook a complicated, high-level recipe in a kitchen where the sink is completely overflowing with dirty dishes. You can't even find the cutting board, let alone focus on the delicate timing of the meal. You have to clear the decks first.
It's practically impossible otherwise.
Does physically cleaning the space actually change our mental state, or is it just about removing distractions?
Oh, it absolutely changes your physiological state.
Right.
When you physically organize your desk, you are sending a potent signal to your brain that a transition is occurring. You are actively moving yourself from a state of chaos and avoidance into a state of structured readiness.
Like flipping a switch.
Exactly. It acts as a physiological primer. You are asserting control over your immediate environment, which reduces your baseline anxiety and prepares your executive function to capitalize on the 2-minute rule we just discussed.
Let's quickly recap. We just covered shrinking the task and clearing the desk. Now let's move to point 3. Tackling the mental blocks. Because I'm sure we've all experienced a situation where the desk is completely spotless. We know exactly what our tiny 2-minute step is, and yet we still sit there completely paralyzed.
We've all been there.
The source material addresses this with Habit 3 optimization through something called the blocker audit. What exactly are we auditing here?
We are auditing the invisible emotional barriers. The protocol dictates that in that moment of paralysis, you must stop and explicitly ask yourself a very uncomfortable question. What specifically am I afraid of right now?
That is a tough question to face.
It is, because we are incredibly skilled at masking our fears with rational-sounding complaints. We blame fatigue, we claim we don't have enough time right now, or we say we need more clarification on the instructions. But if you strip all of those excuses away and audit the block with brutal honesty, the core emotion driving the procrastination is almost universally fear.
Here's where it gets really interesting, noting that the answer to that question isn't a fear of the work itself. It is almost always the fear of judgment. But why is the fear of judgment strong enough to completely derail our productivity?
Because the fear of judgment triggers our evolutionary survival instincts, which manifest in the modern world as perfectionism. We are profoundly social creatures, and historically, social rejection was incredibly dangerous.
So we treat a bad spreadsheet like a threat to our lives.
Today, that translates into a subconscious belief that if we never start the project, we can never be judged on the outcome. The unwritten novel sitting in your desk drawer is perfectly safe because no one has ever criticized it. The spreadsheet you haven't formatted yet can't be scrutinized for errors by your manager.
The moment you begin, you make the work real.
And reality is deeply subject to judgment. Acknowledging this dynamic is what the blocker audit is all about. By simply naming the fear, by saying out loud, I am avoiding this email because I am afraid my client will reject my proposal, you drag the monster out from under the bed. Once it is exposed to the light, it loses its unconscious power over your behavior.
It's incredible how much cognitive energy we waste wrestling with ghosts in the dark. Just calling it out by its real name neutralizes it. But once we name that fear of judgment, how do we actually pull the trigger and get moving? That brings us to habit 4, mental clearing.
This is a highly specific tactic.
Right. The source material introduces the 5-minute timer here.
This is where we deploy that timer. The protocol instructs you to set a physical or digital timer for precisely 5 minutes. But the timer itself isn't the key. It is the critical psychological caveat attached to it. You must explicitly give yourself permission to stop when that timer goes off.
Which feels weird.
You make a binding contract with yourself stating, I am only going to do this for 5 minutes, and then I am completely allowed to walk away with zero guilt.
It sounds almost entirely counterproductive at first glance. Why does giving ourselves an escape route actually help us get the work done?
Imagine the high-pitched, hissing sound of a heavy steam valve slowly releasing its tightly coiled pressure. That sharp, intense screech giving way to a steady, calm rush of air. That is exactly what the 5-minute timer does to the overwhelming pressure in your brain.
It vents all that built-up anxiety.
The anxiety and pressure build up because you feel trapped by the sheer magnitude of the task ahead of you. The timer acts as that release valve, proving to your brain that you are not trapped at all. You have an out. You only have to endure the discomfort for 300 seconds.
And then you're free.
But ironically, due to a psychological phenomenon called the Zeigarnik effect, where uncompleted tasks stick in our minds and drive us to finish them, once you release the pressure and begin working for those 5 minutes, you almost always keep going.
It really is the ultimate mental judo. You are using your brain's own desperate desire for an escape route to trick it into building momentum. Once you are 5 minutes into the work, the agonizing friction of starting is gone.
The hardest part is over.
The natural human desire to finish what we started simply takes over the wheel. You've completely bypassed the procrastination without needing a single drop of this mythical motivation we always seem to be waiting for.
That is the crucial takeaway, because motivation is fundamentally an emotion, and emotions are fleeting and unreliable. This is a deeply mechanical approach to human behavior. You are relying on a structured protocol that respects the neurobiology of fear and friction, rather than waiting for inspiration to magically strike.
We've cleared the mental pressure. Now let's move to our final habit, leverage. Up to this point, we focused heavily on the immediate micro-level tactics, shrinking the task, clearing the desk, naming the fear, and setting the timer. But the protocol shifts gears and zooms out for this last piece.
It takes a much wider view here.
The material suggests biography reading, bringing in the examples of Elon Musk and Arnold Schwarzenegger facing massive odds. Usually, when we look at massively successful people, we just see the highlight reel, right?
We do. We see the rockets launching perfectly into orbit, or the blockbuster movie premieres. We mistakenly assume that because these individuals are high achievers, they must possess some superhuman willpower or flawless discipline that we simply lack.
We think they never stare at a mountain and freeze.
Exactly. But habit 5, leverage, insists that we read their biographies to systematically shatter that illusion. The protocol specifically highlights figures who faced objectively massive, almost insurmountable odds.
But how does reading about a billionaire's problems help someone finish a quarterly report?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, reading these detailed accounts of profound struggle provides a crucial, grounding reminder. Let's look at Schwarzenegger. Before the fame, you had a man with a massive, hard-to-understand accent and an impossibly huge bodybuilder physique trying to break into 1970s Hollywood, which was an era of slender leading men.
He didn't fit the mold at all.
He faced brutal, repeated rejection. He was told he would only ever be cast as a silent, mindless henchman, Or consider Elon Musk in 2008. SpaceX rockets were failing and exploding one after another. Tesla was bleeding cash and days away from total bankruptcy.
Musk was personally facing complete public failure.
When you read about the paralyzing self-doubt and the days where they couldn't figure out the next step, you realize that intense struggle isn't a sign of failure. It is simply part of the process. It is baked into the fundamental recipe of achievement.
It normalizes the pain of the fiction, because when you are sitting at your messy desk, terrified of your boss's judgment, trying to start a tiny 5-minute timer, you feel incredibly isolated. You feel like you are the only broken person in the world who can't just do the work.
You feel uniquely flawed.
Right. But when you read about the titans of industry dealing with rockets exploding, your own struggle suddenly gets placed in its proper, much less terrifying context.
It radically recontextualizes your friction. You stop viewing your procrastination and your fear as a unique personal defect or character flaw. Instead, you view it as the standard toll you have to pay on the road to getting anything meaningful done.
Everyone pays the toll.
The highest performers in the world feel the exact same friction, the exact same threat response in their amygdala that you do. The difference is exclusively in how they leverage protocols to navigate it. They utilize the leverage of knowing that everyone before them fought this exact same invisible war.
Let's quickly recap the 5 keys we just covered. We started with the diagnosis that tasks feel too big, triggering a biological threat response. Then we moved into the specific solutions. 1. The 2-minute rule. To violently shrink the task down to a microscopic first step and lower the activation energy.
Essential for bypassing the amygdala.
2. The environment reset, remembering that a messy desk equals a messy mind, so we have to sharpen the axe and clear the cognitive clutter before we chop the tree. 3. The blocker audit, asking ourselves what we are truly afraid of, to drag that fear of judgment out into the light.
Stripping away the excuses.
4. The 5-minute timer, explicitly giving ourselves the permission to stop so we release the mental steam valve. And 5. Biography reading, leveraging the stories of the greats to remind ourselves that the struggle is just part of the process, not a sign we are failing. So what does this all mean for you? How do we take all of this neuroscience and psychology out of the audio and put it into the real world?
This is where theory must translate into immediate physical action. If you are procrastinating on something right now, stop. Use the 2-minute rule on that specific task immediately after this deep dive ends. Do not wait for tomorrow morning.
Don't wait until you feel motivated.
Do not wait until you feel ready. Find the absolute smallest physical action that moves that specific project forward and execute it the second you finish listening.
No excuses, just a 2-minute action. It's the ultimate proof that the mechanics of the protocol actually work.
And as you move forward and implement this protocol in your daily life, I want to leave you with one final, deeper consideration to reflect upon. If the blocker audit reveals that our procrastination is actually rooted in the fear of judgment, whose judgment are we truly most paralyzed by, the judgment of others or the judgment of our own future selves?
You've made it this far, so why stop now? There are 2 videos on your screen right now that are perfect for you. Just pick the one that looks most interesting and let's dive back in.